I know you won't get slow down till the no good funky knuckle groove. Baby, 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 that'll help for you. Yeah, it's most definitely on a roof.
Hi, folks. My name's Kirk Peterson. We're going to talk about a really interesting story from a mid-level band out of Wasilla, Alaska, Portugal the Man. Here with Nick Harvey from Atlantic Records, Rich Holtzman, manager of Portugal the Man, and Matt Hickey of High Road Touring. We're coming up on about a year since the release of the album Woodstock, with the single Feel It Steel that has amassed a staggering amount of accolades, awards, and charts over the last 11, 12 months. 22 weeks at #1 on the alternative charts, the most by any band of all time. #1 on 6 major airplay charts: radio songs, pop songs, adult pop songs, alternative, adult alternative, and dance mix show. The band has played 1,500 shows over its career. Woodstock with its 9th album. It's 3rd on Atlantic. So this is certainly not an overnight success story, but a success story nonetheless. That being said, we'll just get right into hearing from the guys here how this evolved. Let's start with the previous album, Evil Friends, from 2013. Let's talk a little bit about the success of that album and the touring that followed in that period. Rich, you want to go ahead and just start and talk a little bit about the featured singles and what radio airplay that received on that from that album?
Yeah, when we started Evil Friends, and we were looking for a producer, and up to that point we had kind of just made records and had fun, but there had been a progression to their songwriting, and we were looking to expand upon that. And so we lucked upon Danger Mouse with the help of Craig Kalman at Atlantic, and it just kind of blossomed the band in terms of what they thought they could do. Previously being in the studio had been very much like, all right, get these songs done, we're good, we're done, let's get out of here. And Danger Mouse wouldn't let them do that. He kind of really beat them up about the songs and the craft of songwriting. And we came out of there and, well, we thought we really had some hit singles. And you could argue we did, but they weren't hits. And so we just did what we always did up to that point. We focused on what we knew and what we knew best, which was touring. And this is a band that over the course of their career, every record, 8 records in, has sold more records, has had larger metrics in terms of socials, et cetera, sold more tickets, everything. Each record grows, and there's probably not a band in the history of music that's grown 8 records in a row. Of course, we started really small, so it was easier to grow, but it still growed. And so we went back and we just focused on touring. And we toured and we toured and we toured, and we went to every market we could go to. And we did what the band knew how to do best, is engage their fans with a great live show.
So on that record, was it constant touring for 2 years, a year and a half? Just at what point was there a point where they said we need to take a break? We've got a bunch of new songs. Let's start getting into the studio and recording.
Yeah, it's a constant fight that the band and I have, that there really is no end to the touring cycle. And so what we usually do is we break out a little bit of time where they're going to go and record. But it took them so long between Evil Friends and Woodstock, throwing out a record in the process in between, that they still needed to go and work. They still needed to be a band. And so while the core of the touring cycle was over, we were continually playing shows and festivals and such, because they're that kind of band that could always go and play and make a little bit of money to keep the lights on, and that festivals would always call and say, yeah, we'll have you play. So I think even in the off year, I think we pulled off 60 shows, something like that. That was our down year.
That was 2017 or 2016 prior to the release of Woodstock.
15. Yeah.
Yeah, because then in 16, there was the tour with Cage the Elephant, which was a pretty nice bridge tour to get a lot of people back in and re-excited about the band and introduce them to a lot of radio people and just kept it moving and set it up nicely to go into the campaign for Woodstock.
I mean, I know that the band's first 6 albums came out in quick succession, pretty much once a year from 2006 onward. 2010 was the first album with Atlantic, and then there was a 3-year break to Evil Friends, and then the longer break between that and Woodstock. Was that a direct result of working with the label and having the resources to set up a release that a major label would be looking to?
The corporate devil screwed it up again. No, I'd like to say it and blame it on them, but it was totally on the band. And it happened on The Satanic Satanist, which was record number 4. They realized that, holy crap, we can actually write good songs. And so then they were like, oh, well, let's try harder. And it really blossomed under Danger Mouse, but they realized, like, oh, we can actually spend a little bit of time to do it. And frankly, we had a budget. You know, we had, remember all those records, those previous 3 were DIY records, basically. We had a deal with Equal Vision, but it was basically all DIY. So if you spent 3 weeks in the studio, that's a lot of money.
I know that Danger Mouse was obviously a big presence for Woodstock. John Hill was in the equation. Talk a little bit about how Mike D from the Beastie Boys came across the band and became involved in the recording process. That also brought in Shangri-La Studios, Rick Rubin's spot in Malibu.
Yeah, that was Mike D remixed a song for us off of In the Mountain, off of Evil Friend, sorry, and it was one of those random things. People will remix something for you, and we're like, oh, Mike D, sure. You know, it's only the band's, top band, favorite band. And they just met one day, and they struck up a relationship, and he was living in Brooklyn at the time, and they went into his studio, and they hung out, and they had a great afternoon. They recorded some stuff, and then he was in Malibu for a while, and he was like, hey, let's make a record. When Mike D asks you that, you don't really say no. And so we went in with Mike D, and it was a really great experience for them because it's Mike D. He can do whatever the fuck he wants. And throughout his career, he pretty much did whatever the fuck he wanted. And it was successful. So his response would be, they were like, oh, we can't do that. And it's like, why not? And so it kind of allowed them to kind of really open up of what the creative possibilities would do. And nothing bad about spending a month in Shangri-La Studios drinking smoothies and vegetable juice and hanging out with Mike D. It's a good way to waste a lot of money.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Zach who said a story one day we were out doing promo about Mike D. Was like, they were talking about like his lyric style. And there's like that lyric was, I'm intercontinental when I eat French toasts. And they're like, they asked him about it. He's like, oh yeah, I was probably eating French toast that morning. So like, that's what I put in the song. And they were like, oh yeah, like we can just do whatever. Like we should be having fun writing these songs. So like they were likening it in the new Woodstock song, Keep On, where they're like, I'm like a cartoon slipping out a banana peel. It's just like, why not? Let's have some fun. Let's put some cool creative stuff.
I mean, that's actually a good segue for kind of the genesis of Feel It Still, which, ultimately led to the band's Grammy this winter, which, in the pop category, no less. But I understand that song was kind of a happy accident in some ways of that sort of playfulness in the studio. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that song came about?
They had bounced around, and Mike D and Danger Mouse and John Hill, and it was a real struggle to get where they wanted on the record. And one day they were in the studio just messing around, and Asa Taccone, who's from Electric Guest, who's a friend, happened to be in the studio, stopped by, and John, the lead singer, songwriter of the band, just sitting there playing a bass line. And he's like, Ace is like this short, excitable, smiley, happy dude. And he's just like, yo, Johnny, what's you playing? That's awesome. Can I record it? And he just kind of said, oh yeah, I'll play that bass line. He played it. He's like, you got a guitar line? Yeah, I got this. And he just kept pushing John. And he's like, what's the melody? And John didn't have a melody at that point. And he's like, well, I've been trying to write a song that went like, Please, Mr. Postman. So he was just singing Please, Mr. Postman over it. And literally 45 minutes later, the song's done. And there's little nuances and bits and pieces that they had to do to get it right. But it was Asa being there pushing John to be, like, keep going, and that it was just a compatriot. It wasn't a producer. It wasn't an A&R man. It was just a friend who's also a musician. Just wrangled it out of John really quickly. We sat on the song for 2.5 years and couldn't get it right. We knew it was close, but we knew it wasn't right. And John must have hated me so much because we'd always talk about it, and we're like, maybe it's the bridge. And I think there's 30 different bridges that he wrote for it, and it wasn't the bridge. And we kept beating it up, and we were just like, it wasn't right. And then one day we said, well, let's send it over to John Hill and see what John thinks of it. John sends it back 24 hours later or something like that. And all he did was basically took the beat that we had, changed the tones and the hits on it, but it's basically the same exact beat, send it back to us, and we're like, holy fuck, that's it. And that was the end of the song. Yeah. But you had to take that journey from song's perfect.
500 million Spotify plays later.
Yeah.
And you guys, the band was playing it on the road before it was finished for a while too, right?
And which is where we figured out that the song wasn't quite working. We couldn't figure out, we played it live for a while, and we were like, song's good, but it's not right. I couldn't figure it out.
And this was happening in like late in the process, the fall of 16, when you were trying to kind of finish up the record. It kind of just came to pass by that.
We threw a curveball, and we started the touring for the album cycle in the fall of 2016. And only like 3 songs on the album were done. Feel It Still was not done. And we were like, well, one way to get it started is to tell them tour started. Because if we felt like it would go on forever if we didn't put a line in the sand and said, you're going on tour. So by the time we started touring, that wasn't done. It came back in January, I think it was, before we went back on tour in February. And we figured out Feel It Still. And then we started the mixing process really quickly.
So Matt, during that period in that fall, I mean, were you fielding offers from festivals for the summer of 17 and trying to figure out whether or not you were ready to take that step, or if you wanted to maybe wait a year for the album to kick in and get the value of the following festival season? Was that a discussion that you all were having?
Yeah, it was. I think the 2016 motivation more than anything was the band was away for a couple of years from formal touring, and so we felt it was a good idea that when those guys go on the road, their socials begin to engage a lot, and they're the best ambassadors for themselves when they're on the road. So when they went out in November, there was things like the Troubadour in LA, a really small play. There was a Bowery in New York that kind of really got the core fan base of the band excited. There was a lot of college markets in the first November go-around where it really, and I think at the end, it kind of ended up being a really good, empowering thing for the band to go off and not be sharing the bill with another act or playing a festival set, which is usually an hour at most, but being able to play a real Portugal the Man show to real fans, re-engage some members that had joined, like Jason came back into the fold. I always say it's like the Grateful Dead. Like, it sounds like the Dead when Bill Kreutzmann's playing, and it sounds like Portugal the Man when Jason's playing drums, you know? So it helped him come back in. Eric was just getting up to speed, I think, with the band, and so that was a lot of the November. But I think that they were out in that time period and demonstrating strength where they were selling out all those shows. That's when people are booking festivals, you know, when they're thinking about what they want to do the next year. And Rich made some, I think, really smart decisions saying, let's pass on Bonnaroo, or not Bonnaroo, but Lollapalooza, Coachella, some of the really bigger festival looks that we...
All the festivals that you're playing this year.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And for better offers and later in the day and better billing. I mean, I think it's arguably when the Coachella lineup came out and where the band was billed on the Coachella lineup, that was a direct result of waiting, having the band and the single do its work, and it really sent a message to everybody in this coming year when you see the band billed like the third name on the day at Coachella. It really did kind of change the landscape a bit for them.
Yeah, it's really hard.
That billing is showing up this year at Coachella, Hangout, Boston Calling, Mountain Jam, Firefly, Outside Lands, Lollapalooza, and multiple amphitheaters and small arenas throughout Europe, North America, and Japan, just for the record.
Yeah, it's really hard when you get that Coachella offer to look at it and say, nah. But we knew the self-reflection of what are we and where do we sit and what is our value. We knew that there's no way that Paul was going to give us the slot we wanted in that point in the cycle. No matter how big anything was, not even counting on Feel It Still being a
how
single.
much he loves the band.
He can't. It wasn't even about the money. It was only about, well, what slot can we play? And being hypersensitive to the fact that rock bands have a really hard time at festivals. So it's critical where you put yourself. And we were like, no fucking way.
Because, this band does have one thing that I've never found universally across the board, is that every single festival and promoter in the world loves them and wants them to succeed. But when you can couple that with, the radio story and the single that they've had, then you're really even kind of letting them make their job even that much easier to kind of push them to that next place. And I think the band's been pushed into some places where, you have to go like, this is an opportunity here, and can they rise to their game? And, the Coachella sets they played this last weekend were really, career highlight moments for me working in the music business, to see a band that's been at it for so long be able to step up on the main stage at 7 o'clock at night and take 100% full advantage of that opportunity, which they really did. So,
and just looking back on that fall of 16 and that spring 17 tour, we actually had a show in Vegas, which came just prior to the release of the album, but there was just something about it. There was still enough buzz. The show did great, but we did it without. I think Feel It Still came out like 2 weeks after that show. But at any rate, can you give some examples of some markets that you played in that early stages that you're going back to play amphitheaters this summer? And what the venue was the first time around?
I think Rich and I kind of did this thing where you break down each market, like whatever the market may be, we kind of pick the 15 or 17 major ones and say, these are the 3 plays that we want to try to get off of this. And it's really helped us keep our focus as to what the plan was. Like in Chicago, if it was, this play to the Riviera to here to Lollapalooza, then we kind of went through and we were able to kind of carve up the country as to far as like what needed to happen in the 15 or 20 major markets. And then it gives you kind of a sketch of what's left over, of which you have to work from. But if you're always working from the template of like, what are the LA plays? What's happening in San Francisco? What are we going to do in Seattle? What are we going to do in these important markets that will drive the country and the touring for the band? That we have to keep a real clear idea of what those moves are in those markets. So that's kind of how we, I think, kept track of how they were able to do it. Where now come in Chicago, I think there might be 4 plays, with Lollapalooza being the 4th play from 16 until now, So, and that's, if you look at the amount of tickets and the amount of people they're playing and the income, it's, I don't think we've, used up Chicago fully, I don't think it's like, but that's also like being able to delay those times and make sure you're putting it at the right time, and not going for it's a major market. We need the income. Let's put this into the first go around. Let's see where it really fits, where this is the goal. What do we have to do to get to there, you know? So.
And you're doing a lot of things that sometimes promoters really are not happy about. You know, when we come through, we're playing your market, guess what? The single comes out 2 weeks later. Or we're playing your market, the album's not going to be out yet. But we bet on ourselves. We took a little gamble. We thought we had a good single. We thought it'd do okay. And we thought that if we got more touring on the front end of the cycle, that we'd be able to get an extra bite or two on the back end of the cycle if we started them tight. And then that single happened, and it happened in the most ridiculous way, so the cycle's going to keep going.
So Nick, going back to radio, when you had the single in your hands and you're making these predictions about the success of it, where it was going to be, where it was going to resonate, did you identify alternative radio and adult alternative as the airplays you're going for? Did you anticipate any of the pop or dance mix successes?
First and foremost, it was definitely alternative radio and AAA to set it up. And Matt, you said it too, like on that March and April tour, which was, we put Feel It Still Out at the top of that, there was a lot of AAA markets built into there on purpose because you knew that was going to be the first step. Like we need to get AAA covered and saturated, and that would translate to alternative success. And it worked because I think like by mid-April, like towards the end of the tour, it hit number one at AAA. And then a couple months later is when it hit number one at alternative.
And so when you did a handful of radio shows last December, the holiday radio shows, how many formats did you play?
Only alternative.
Only alternative?
Yeah, we kind of took a stand that we wouldn't do any pop radio shows because at the end of the day, band's an alternative rock band. And frankly, putting I
mean, you did open for Beyonce at Coachella, but...
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
No, we opened for Eminem. Putting that band, I can imagine I think we're up to 39 inputs on a pop radio show. They're used to bands that come up with like 4 inputs. And we would walk up, they wouldn't have no idea what to do, how to fit us in on that, and it would be bad.
And when the band was in these AAA markets, they were able to go in and like engage with radio and those people who were there. And if those guys can go in and meet people and do their thing, it's once again what people figure out about the band is that they're really excellent people and they're in it for the right reasons and, you know, they're a real band. So while they were in those markets and being able to accomplish all those kind of radio favors or things you can do to help support the campaign, they didn't have to do that later on when they had to be focusing on the alternative radio picture. So they weren't like making people feel left out because they already got the band in their time, and we were able to kind of go through and give some presents to a few people that were really key players, but then keep it neutral and betting that Atlantic would continue their work on the single, you know, so.
Yeah.
I would say that there's not Nick, but many other people at the label were really unhappy about how we decided to tour. And they thought we were crazy for touring right on the single, way before the album. And we thought differently because we thought the best asset was the band being in the market and the band working. And Nick kind of drives a lot of the schedule. And is there a band that works harder?
Yeah, no. It wasn't crazy, especially that. It was crazy that March, April tour. I think there was 29 shows. They did promotions for 29 different stations on that tour, which meant like every single day they were going somewhere. If they had a day off, then the next day they were doing two things for the alternative and the AAA. And yeah, I mean, yeah, there was a bunch of people who weren't too stoked about the idea of you going on tour again especially without the album being finished. I guess what we're talking about is like, this isn't the traditional way, right? You would tour a rock band, and when you're setting up a record, is to like start the cycle when the single's not even done and the other songs haven't been selected or being mixed. But, you know, you guys stuck to your guns, and it ended up being the right call, especially for getting the single going, because if we had done it our way, what probably would have ended up happening was they would have pushed a lot of this touring further, but then to launch Feel It Still, we would have put the band on a promo tour, which would be, the 5 guys and plus 2 out flying or driving to different cities, doing these radio sort of sessions and interviews and all that stuff. But that gets expensive quicker because there's no income coming in. So then you might just have to identify, what's 10 taste-making alternative AAA markets we can get to. And so then you can't go to 29 stations with that configuration. So by scheduling the touring starting in March, it gave like a 2-month runway. It's like, okay, here's the single, which they went into the Portland stations to premiere it. And then, okay, now let's just go hit every single station we possibly can over these next 2 months and get this thing played.
I don't think either, too, like it kind of took away the idea of like the album, and put it more onto the band, and kind of it seems like kind of a new way where before you would, well, what's the street date? When are we going to start this? And when is this? Where I think it was kind of a little bit geared on, there was a radio campaign that was going on. There was some life to the single, and having the band be out working would be the best way to aid the campaign. But it wasn't like we did things not thinking about like where you used to kind of do it like, well, let's look at the street date and then let's work backwards from there about what we're going to do before the street date and what we're going to do after, where they just kind of toured all the way before and through it. You kind of, the band maybe got a little bit crispy, right? I mean, because they've been working a lot before the record came out. But I do think all that work that they did leading up to this did help it put wind in the sails to the single.
Absolutely. That was the argument I always had with the label. They were like, when's the release date on the album? I'm like, when we're ready. It was done and it was in the can, and put it out when we're ready. We don't need a date today. If there's anything any touring band should be concerned with, it's breaking the album cycle. Because that crutch is debilitating to bands, I think.
I mean, I don't know if every band could have done it like Portugal the band did, because you guys have built the fans in the right way that you could put up a tour with one video out and have the tour starting when you put out the single, and the fans were going to show up and the tour was going to be a success. Like, that's a credit to the business they built.
Because they started as a jam band.
Still a jam band. So we've talked a fair amount about Feel It Still. Live in the moment. It's almost like it's just now starting to get serviced, and I'm certain I'm wrong about that. But how much longer? I mean, what was the original plan to move into the second song on radio? I mean, Feel It Still just kept going and going. I guess the other part of that question was, how many of these alternative formats were you all with the label and Rich? How many of these stations were you called? Were they just getting added out of thin air, or were you working like, we should try to hit adult pop? We should try, or how did those ads come about?
I mean, the Atlantic radio team is awesome, and we have 2 heads, or Ron Poor, the head of alternative promotions, and Brendan works with him, and we have like 12 people stationed around the country who. I mean, I remember before it came out, you don't usually hear this in meetings, but Ron was like, he came back, he's like, yeah, I just played it for people, like, this is a hit. Like, usually people want to mitigate the risk a little bit, but he was like, no, this is going. This will be a number 1 at alternative radio. We're like, Ron, you want to say that right now? Yeah. Like, and he was like, yeah, no, this is going to happen. And they went for it. And I think as it got, 22 weeks up there, some of the hot AC stations and top 40s just started picking up on it. Like there are some stations that are like have sister stations at the top 40s, so they started to hear about it and the success was happening. So they just knew and just started putting it in. And I think it was in July that the hand was forced, where it was like, okay, we're going to go to hot AC and top 40 radio, and it just started going. And for talk about alternative and the ascent. Usually, so first of all, you ship out a record, meaning you send it to all the stations, and then you try to go for ads or your impact date about a month later, maybe 6 weeks. With Feel It Still, it was only 2 weeks because the reaction was so great and people just started playing it. So So that was accelerated. And then for the first 10 weeks, it was up 200 spins a week. And basically just all the stations were liking it. It was reacting, it was researching well, and it just started soaring up.
I think the key to it was that we waited. We didn't rush it. Like, a lot of people would say you just try to start crossing your single from alternative to pop around the time when you get to number one, and then start looking, take that momentum and roll it into pop. We took a different approach, and love Atlantic for being patient on it. We were like, what's the research? What's the call out? What's the data? Do not cross it until we have everything in place. So by the time we crossed it, we were already getting number one research, number one data, number one Shazam, like, you know, record number singles, like, and you were like, yeah, it's ready. So, you know, only step up, like, I kind of feel that you only step up to pop radio if you know you can get on bass. It's too dangerous to swing and miss. Can't go back.
I think I read that the album has been top 10 in 13 countries. I know that the band's spending a big chunk of time in Europe this summer. Talk a little bit about what steps Atlantic took to push the album and the single in Europe, and how do you all have a European team? How exactly does that shake out?
Yeah, we've got teams all over the world who were there. I mean, each territory, though, was going at different times. Some were very fast onto it. Like Russia, was that the first ex-US country to go number one or platinum?
First country to go gold.
Oh, gold, yeah. Oh, how about
Russia.
That? But then some territories...
How many has gold in Russia?
14.
17 real records, yeah.
Yeah. But then,
go ahead.
But then there were some that took a while. Like UK, it was like one of the last territories to break, and that was only like a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, I think what happened ultimately is the performance was so strong in the US and a couple other territories that it came from the top down at Atlantic, and they said, like, look, I don't care what anybody's saying, you're taking this as one of the top 2 or 3 priorities in the world for Warner Music Group, and you're going to make it happen because it goes on the radio and it works. And the one holdout was the UK. They were just not into it, and
They're tired of listening to Americans.
yeah, and it was really like having conversations with Radio 1 were just, you know, they were debilitating, and eventually, I don't know exactly what happened, but Craig Kalman basically put his foot down and was like, you're going to play this record and you're going to give it a fucking shot. And they did, and literally weeks later it was their biggest researching record.
How are the hard ticket plays in Europe selling this summer?
Well,
Your European hard ticket plays, how are they selling?
everything's going pretty good. We're going, you know, I would say we're not sold out yet, but everything will sell out. It's depending on the territory, anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 caps. And I think they're in Australia right now.
What size rooms did you play the last time you were in Europe?
We've always done well in Germany, but even in Germany would be on the 3,000 sides where we would have done, 1,500 or 1,000. And in the UK, we're playing, it's been sold out for a while already, Forum, which is 2,000. Where we would have been, in the UK, we're really bad. We were like at 500 probably. So we've taken significant jumps. But at the end of the day, we also want to play the right venues and clubs and not reach too far, because we want that live experience. Because if we go in and play a show and it doesn't give you Portugal the Man, we know longevity-wise we're screwed.
That's also another thing, I think, on the record cycle and the way it went on this album, that when the band was touring so far and touring throughout the cycle, that when the success of the radio single did continue to build, that the band had always kind of been out and working. It wasn't like, oh, this band with this big radio single has just come out of nowhere. And, like you're always a little bit, look at that a little strange and say, what is this? What does this mean? What is their value? But that they had some time to build their audience and then was working through the whole thing, it didn't seem so dramatic, you know what I mean? It just kind of seemed like it was a nice progression, and it felt a lot more authentic and real because fans were engaging throughout the whole process, you know? And it wasn't just, let's wait and see what the single does, and then when it blows up, let's go out. And so maybe you don't get as much of that, like, on the on sale, bang, it sells. But I think career-wise and longevity-wise, them being able to take a step into the kind of venues and sizes that they're playing in 18, that being able to be successful at that level, and it will really help them in the long term of their career. But they worked their way through that, and it wasn't like, you know, let's just see what happens with the radio, you know, so.
It's kind of just looking ahead, and we'll take some questions here in a minute. So in October, the band's playing 2 arenas in home state of Alaska and Anchorage. I understand they maybe could have added a third if the date was there. That will kind of be the culmination of 2 years of touring on the album cycle, even though the first 6 months didn't have an album. What's the plan? It's going to go, do you have songs to go into the studio with? When are you going to go back out? What do you see happening for, you know, say the next 12 months, getting best back to like May of 2019?
That's the conversation we were just happening. They pretty much end touring at the end of September. We are going to record all through October, plus do those 2 arena shows in Alaska. And then we might jump over to Europe for a short time in November. But if not, we'll be recording through the end of the year with the goal of hopefully having the record done by the end of December of this year. And then we're talking about how we start it up. You know, how much time do we get away? You know, knowing September 2018 is the ending, when is a long enough break away from things to go into 2019? But that also allows us to get down to South America, get to Africa, get another trip over to Asia, and start to use those markets in the delay
I want to go on the Africa tour.
Yeah, that was a follow-up question there, but we'll take questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question about Africa?
Hi there. So my question essentially is, did you start your own management with Portugal The Man? Did you do other things before that? And if so, what were some of the things that you knew you had to do and you slowly found out that you had to do in that job?
Yeah, I started working with Portugal The Man about 12 years ago. They had basically just put out their first record. Thanks, Pete. And at that point, I had my own management company. I started on my own, basically. I was running a record label at the time as well. And I had been running record labels for years at that point, so I kind of knew that part of the business already. I needed to learn a lot about touring, which I knew a bit, but not nearly the fraction of what I know now. And I did it on my own for a bit. Then I partnered up with a management company called the Artists Organization, and I did that for a few years, and then I separated again, and did it on my own, and then went over to Red Light Management and partnered up with them. But really, it's just me in Portugal. Exactly, yeah. It's when, like, as a manager, you kind of always dream of having that relationship of you and that band that do it forever, you know, and you think of the great relationships throughout the history of rock and roll, and it's always like one manager and one band that you're like, oh yeah, that's the way, you know, that's the way to do it. So that relationship, when that relationship develops, you kind of finish each other's thoughts. You fight like cats and dogs, and it's something special.
This is the first time in a couple years I've seen you without any Portugal merch on your body at the moment.
I don't, that's right.
You have a t-shirt on under there?
I like to be economical and wear free clothes.
We have any other questions out there?
Yeah, hey guys, thank you. What did the touring situation look like in the very beginning, and how much was social media's a play in the very beginning?
Those are good questions. In 2006, the touring was, and early dates, the guys tell the story really well about how they literally left home in a minivan. Like one of the moms had a minivan. They took the minivan, they stacked it up as high as they could with all their gear. They had a rice cooker. They had like a 5-pound bag of rice, and they would have to lie on top of the gear, like there'd be 1.5 feet or so between the top of the gear and the roof of the car, and they'd have to lie down the whole time. And they just kind of realized that you could go from one market to the next market, and the promoter in the next market would give you enough money to get to the next market. And they were dumb and from Alaska, and they thought that was awesome. And they just literally just got in their van and drove. And they were happy. They were like, the big day was when they went to McDonald's and the dollar menu, everyone got $2. And they were like, we're living. And so they spent a bit of time doing that. And we moved quickly into social media. I remember, I can't remember when it was, but someone here probably knows, but I think Facebook wasn't even open publicly yet. It was still a student-run thing, and I had a bunch of interns. But if we did MySpace, we were really active on MySpace for a while there. They even had a record label that wanted to sign us that we smartly didn't do. But like even on Facebook, I used to have interns, and they would go and, because they were students, they would place advertisements and stuff for us for like $5 on Facebook. And one of the first bands on all socials, Twitter, Instagram. So they've been really active, and the key to them was we never looked at it as a broadcast. It was always like, oh, this is a way that you could speak directly to somebody and be personable. And it was their personality that was at their shows. They would never hide. They would never go backstage and not hang out. They were always that band that was really approachable and hang out, and that's how the ethos of social media was great for us. Though our gross numbers are not massive by any means, our engagement and our interaction is off the charts.
Yeah, it's like an ongoing conversation that you have with your fans, and those guys are really good at it.
Yeah, I was going to say, too, for some of the early shows, because I've been a fan for a while and gone to a lot of those, but like each time, even from 2006 or 2007, like each tour, the band was constantly evolving and doing new things. I remember like seeing an early show where like they had the lights on the ground and it was like shining up and down. I'm like, whoa, like like Maxwell's, like who brings a light show into Maxwell's that they're touring with? And it was like they were doing it themselves, and I was like, oh, this is cool.
And it's like 4 lights.
Yeah, it's like 4 lights. But like each time, they're like, oh, now we're going to add in this new jam on this tour.
Well, it's making lemonade at that point because John, the lead singer, has got terrible stage fright. And so he would play with a hood over his hat and a hat pulled down facing the wrong way. But we found out that if you blast Home Depot lights into his eyes, he wouldn't know there was audience out there. That's true. So we were just put a lot of smoke on, a lot of haze, and flash lights at him, and he'll go up there and play.
That's the origin. That's awesome.
Yeah. Matt, what year did you sign the band?
What year was that?
Were they sitting in seats, or were they laying by the roof of the van?
I think Rich
2009.
Rich called me up. They were with another agent, and I think they were playing a little bit in kind of that fringe alternative press emo world they'd found themselves in. And I think Rich said, we have to get the band beyond this world, because he was afraid of a lot of bands that he could see in that scene just kind of getting stuck in that scene. There were a couple of very big bands, and then there was everybody else. And when High Road started working with them, I think the first thing we did is we started, which was weird for them, is we put them in some 21 and over venues. And they were worried that their audience wouldn't go, but what they hadn't realized is that their 17, 18-year-old audience had aged. And I think that kind of moved them into another world of promoters and bands seeing them. And then they did a couple of 2-night stands in a few kind of important music markets: Austin, Boulder, Colorado, Chicago, places where they have, and they were able to engage their fans even more. Show what a good live band they'd become just by the sheer number of shows they played. I mean, they really are a spectacular live band because they really have worked so long and hard at becoming one. So that kind of got them, I think, that kind of pulled the Band-Aid off of getting them off that world. And I think it exposed them to people like the Superfly people and other kinds of promoters that could find out about them. And then they kind of found their way in on being kind of a rock fringe kind of act that was very unique in the space. Wasn't like a jam band, but was a really...
More like Black Rebel and Black Angel, like psych.
Yeah, there was some psychedelicness to their live show and to their lights, I think. But yeah, that's kind of how I think we came in.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
So for Feel It Still, one aspect that I think really shot that song into the mainstream was the vitamin water commercial with Aaron Paul. What was the decision-making process for that opportunity, especially for a band that is so artistically driven like Portugal the Man?
So there's two syncs that happened early on. It was the vitamin water sync and it was an Apple iPad sync. And we were juggling between which one would go first. And I think we have a really, I guess, unusual perspective on syncs. We're kind of into them because they grew up in Alaska and they have a wholly different perspective of music and how you discover music. So they really only discovered music from basically skateboard or snowboard films and what was on TV. And so they hear a song on a TV show and they're like, that's fucking cool. And I think what those syncs do now is they just help raise the profile so significantly for a song that you have to embrace them. In my mind, there's very few bad syncs. I mean, you have to look at them all, and you really have to make sure it's right and the time it's right and why you're picking and saying yes. But I think they're great, and I don't think there's. I think a lot of artists get too precious about it.
I think in some way too, it makes it begin to sound kind of mainstream. You know, when you hear that and that is out there in the world and being put out there so many times in so many ways when you're watching television or on your computer and you're like, what is that? Why do I know that? What is that thing that other than...
Undoubtedly that helps.
Yeah.
But also, like sometimes fans will come up and say to the guys like, oh, you put your song in a Cadillac commercial. And they're like, yeah. And your choice here is you can have our song, which we think is a pretty awesome song, in this commercial, or you can have some other shitty song in the commercial. Which would you rather?
The shitty song.
Let's get the good songs in there. Let's get good music in commercials, and then life will be better for everybody.
No doubt.
Yeah, there was that kind of that mindset with some of the more pop opportunities where it's like, yeah, wouldn't you rather have like a real rock band playing instruments playing on the AMAs? It's like, yeah, we all want more of that. Like, let's do it.
Yeah, like we went on to AMAs, people were shocked by it. We had, what is that thing called? Kids Bobs, if there's any parents out here, there's this.
Number 6 is very good.
It's these little kids singing their favorite pop songs, and we're like, that's hilarious. That's awesome. Yeah, hell yeah, we want to do that. Because if your song hits this cultural moment, like, I can't tell you how many videos we have of people singing the song, little kids dancing to songs. This woman came out who had cancer the other night who, like, this song was this thing that got her through it. Like, when that shit starts to roll in, you're like, oh, yeah, let's keep doing that, because it makes a difference.
Amen.
All right, I think that's all the time we have. Let's put our hands together for these gentlemen for coming out and come back for 2020 for Portugal, the Africa.